Dr. Ethan J. Temeles is the Thomas B. Walton Jr. Memorial Professor of Biology and Environmental Studies at Amherst College and has been on the faculty since 1994. He was elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2021 for distinguished contributions to ecology, evolution, and behavior, and has been both a junior and senior member at the Smithsonian Institution. His research on the purple-throated Carib hummingbird and its heliconia food plants, the subjects of his presentation, has been featured in 3 BBC productions and Nature PBS, and is preserved as a permanent display in the United States Museum of Natural History. So I'd like to give a warm welcome from all of us here to Dr. Temeles.
Thank you. I'm going to try and call up my slides for all of you. Can everybody see that?
Not yet, no.
No, okay.
A sparrow just popped up.
There we go.
There
we go.
Okay. Thank you for that nice introduction, Vince, and thanks you to the members of the Allen Bird Club for coming out here tonight. As Vince told you, I'm a professor of biology and environmental studies at Amherst College, and my specialization is ecology. And if you were to look at a textbook on ecology, it defines ecology as the study of interactions of organisms with their living and non-living environment. And that's a very dry definition, and it doesn't really explain what ecologists do. And as I tell my students, what ecologists try to do is explain why the world looks the way it does. That is, why do you find this species here and not somewhere else? Why does a given species look, act, and behave the way it does? And if you stop and think about it, answering questions like that is pretty intimidating. How would you even know where to start? Well, one approach has been to take patterns of morphological variation among closely related species to make inferences about the kinds of ecological mechanisms that might have created those patterns. And this approach traces back to Charles Darwin. When Charles Darwin observed the remarkable variation in bill size and shape of the 14 species inhabiting the Galapagos Islands, he remarked that it was though the beak of a single ancestral finch had been taken and modified for different ends. And it was Darwin's realization that the bills of these birds had evolved as a result of interactions with each other and with their environment that helped shape his theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, as an undergraduate at Cornell University, 50 years ago, I was extremely fortunate to have taken a course in evolution taught by a professor there named William L. Brown Jr., who was one of Edward O. Wilson's mentors, and along with Wilson, published a famous paper on competition and how competition can shape the evolution of species. And Professor Brown had us read all sorts of wonderful readings. I was inspired by his course, and one of the books he had us read was a book on Darwin's finches by David Lack, who was a pioneering British ecologist in the 1940s. He predated Peter and Rosemary Grant at Princeton University by 30 years. And reading that book and these other papers got me thinking, well, gee, if interactions of species with each other and their environment can shape their evolution, might not the same sort of interactions, feeding ecology and competition, drive the evolution of sex differences or sexual dimorphisms? Now, the idea that feeding ecology and competition for food can drive the evolution of sex differences is very different from the usual explanation that biologists give for sexual dimorphisms. Most biologists explain the evolution of sex differences by invoking Darwin's theory of sexual selection. And Darwin was very thorough in thinking about evolutionary mechanisms in biology. And to explain the evolution of sex differences, he presented a theory of sexual selection, in which he argued that a differential success among members of one sex, usually males, in direct competition or attraction of mates leads to the development of secondary sexual characteristics of dominance, fighting ability, and mate attraction. Now, you are looking at not a modern day rooster or hen, but actually a pair of jungle fowl, which are the ancestors of our modern day domesticated rooster and hen. The male is on the left, the female is on the right. And Darwin would argue that the larger male size in this species could have evolved through sexual selection if males fight to obtain matings with females, and larger size is an advantage in winning those fights. In this case, the largest males would be the ones that win the fights. They would be the ones that get to mate, and assuming that large male size is passed on from father to son, this would result in a species in which males are larger than females. In the same way, he might argue that the brighter plumage of these males could evolve through female choice of males for mates. Females would choose the males with the showiest plumage. Again, they would be the ones to mate, and their genes would be passed on from father to son. Darwin was an extremely thorough biologist, and in reviewing sex differences in the animal kingdom, he noted that there were some examples of sexual dimorphisms that could not be explained by his theory of sexual selection, but required an explanation based on natural selection. And in particular, he noted that some sex differences may have evolved to allow the sexes to partition the niche through differences in feeding behavior and diet. And the example that Darwin used is this one, the New Zealand huia. The huia was about the size of a small crow, and the sexes were alike in plumage. But the bill of the male was short, thick, and straight, and the bill of the female was long, slender, and curved. Apparently, the male may have used his short, stout bill to chisel in wood for insects, much like a woodpecker, whereas the female may have used her long, slender bill to probe in crevices for insects. But we don't really know, because this bird went extinct in the early 1900s, a fate that befell many of New Zealand's remarkable birds. I read about huias in the 1970s, and for the next 20 years searched for a modern day equivalent of the huia to study the idea that feeding ecology and competition for food could drive the evolution of sexual dimorphisms. And in the 1990s, I found it with a publication of a book called Hummingbirds of the Caribbean by Robert and Esther Tyrrell. And in their book, they had this picture of this lovely hummingbird, the Purple-throated Carib, Euamblus jugularis. The Purple-throated Carib is native to the mountainous islands of the Lesser Antilles, an arc of volcanic islands southeast of Puerto Rico. It's one of the most beautiful hummingbirds you're ever going to see. They have this beautiful rose-colored throat or gorget, iridescent green wings, and a black plumage. And if you look at this bird here, it's an adult male. And this bird here is an adult female. And as I toggle back and forth, you can see that the sexes are alike in plumage. But despite their similarity in plumage, male and female purple-throated caribs possess some of the most extreme sexual dimorphisms of any hummingbird species, or any bird species for that matter. First, males are 25% larger than females, weighing 10 grams to a female's 7.5. To put the body mass in perspective, when I first started working on hummingbirds 40 years ago, I was working on ruby-throated and rufous hummingbirds, and I would catch them and put them on an electronic balance to weigh them. And just out of curiosity, I got a penny out of my pocket and weighed it. A rufous hummingbird or ruby-throated hummingbird weighs about 3 grams, roughly the weight of a penny. These male purple-throated caribs are 10 grams, more than 3 times the body mass. This is one of the largest hummingbirds in the world, and it requires a lot of energy to fuel it. Now, despite the male being so much larger than the female, it's the female that has the longer bill. the bill of the female is 25% longer and 40% more curved than the bill of the male. If you remember, one of the explanations for larger male size is sexual selection and male combat. And I certainly published a study showing that male combat does drive the evolution of large male size in this species. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but if somebody has a question, please ask me about it. In this case, if bill size was simply a passive consequence of larger body size, you'd expect the male to have the larger bill, but he doesn't. It's the female that has the larger bill. And because hummingbirds feed with their bills, as do all birds or most birds, I decided that if feeding ecology and competition for food could drive the evolution of a sex difference, the purple-throated Carib would be the species in which to see it. And so in May of 1999, I began one of the first of dozens and dozens of expeditions to the Caribbean to study the hummingbirds there. And the first island I went to was St. Lucia. St. Lucia is one of the islands in the Lesser Antilles, located between Martinique and St. Vincent. And virtually all of the islands in the Lesser Antilles, with the exception of Barbados, are on a volcanic arc. And these are the national landmarks of St. Lucia, the Pitons, Petit Piton in the foreground and Gros Piton in the background. There's actually a resort called the Jalousie Plantation located right in between them. And even if you do not have the money to stay at these resorts, which I most certainly do not, you can drive there to visit their beach. And it's really one of the most amazing sights I've ever seen in my life. Basically, you go snorkeling and swimming at the base of Petit Piton, where there's this sheer wall going up 1,700 feet right up behind you. And I call it being Yosemite at the beach. And then in the distance, you have this perfectly symmetrical Gros Piton rising up 2,500 feet. This resort has now become quite popular, and the actor Matt Damon actually rented it 10 years ago for an entire weekend to repeat his marriage vows. Now, tourism is one of the sources of income for a lot of these countries. On St. Lucia, the other source of income were bananas, or is bananas. And as a result, much of the island's rainforest has been deforested, and only about 17% remained in 4 protected reserves on the island. And I decided that the first step in studying the purple-throated Carib would be to hike through the island rainforest to determine what are the food plants of this bird. Most of the studies that have been done up to this point had only been done in flower gardens. And this is a picture I took of Qualess Reserve, the largest rainforest reserve on St. Lucia. It's about 4 miles out on the trail. And it gives you an idea of what less disturbed Caribbean rainforest looks like in the Lesser Antilles. Well, it turned out that this task of hiking through the rainforest and determining the food plants was actually easier than one might expect, because there really were only 2 food plants for the purple-throated Carib in the rainforest understory, and both of them were heliconias. Heliconias are a genus of plants in the zingiberales. This is a group of plants that include the heliconias, gingers, cannas, birds of paradise, and bananas. And heliconias are distributed in the Caribbean, Central, South America, and the South Pacific. The plants in the Caribbean and Central and South America are pollinated by hummingbirds. Those in the South Pacific are pollinated by bats. These are plants that range in height from 3 feet tall to over 30 feet tall or taller for the bat-pollinated species. You're looking at a photo I took of my student Jed Horwit next to a clump of heliconia. Jed is 6'3", so you can get an idea of just how big these plants are. They can be quite huge. Now, in heliconia, these plants produce flowering stalks or inflorescences. And in many of these heliconia, the inflorescence or the color of the plant and flowers are not provided by the flowers themselves, but rather by bracts on the inflorescences. And bracts are modified leaves. And if you were to cut open the bracts, you would find a cartridge of flowers within them, much like the bullets in a gun chamber or gun cartridge. And each bract may have anywhere from 1 to 30 flowers per bract, there may be 20 bracts per inflorescence and up to 40 inflorescences per plant. Each flower produces 100 to 250 microliters of nectar. To put that in perspective, one of the plants I worked on in the Amherst area that flowers during the summertime around Amherst and Springfield and along the entire eastern seaboard is jewelweed, Impatiens capensis. It's the flower that looks like a little trumpet or horn, and it's orange, and it's pollinated both by hummingbirds and bumblebees as well as honeybees. That flower produces 2 to 4 microliters of nectar. These flowers again produce 100 to 250 microliters of nectar. This is a big hummingbird that requires a lot of nectar. Now, each flower only lasts a single day, but because you can have as many as 20 or 30 flowers per bract and as many as 20 bracts per inflorescence and 40 inflorescences per plant, a single plant can provide food for a purple-throated Carib for a month to 4 months. And it really is the Fort Knox of hummingbird plants. I also want to emphasize that this is the keystone plant of tropical rainforests. It's just a major food source for everything. Now, it turns out there were only 2 species of heliconias native to Dominica or native to St. Lucia that served as the food plants for these birds. And one of them was a red-bracted Heliconia caribea, shown here, and the other was a green-bracted Heliconia baha'i. Well, this is great. We have 2 species of heliconias, 2 sexes of hummingbirds. The obvious question to ask is, do the sexes differ in their use of these heliconias? My students and I simply sat in front of patches of the 2 heliconia species to watch what visited them, and we found that the answer is yes. Males were associated exclusively with the red-bracted Heliconia caribea, which they defended as territories against members of their own and other hummingbird species. Females intruded on male territories to steal food and also fed at undefended patches of the red-bracted Heliconia caribea, and they were the sole visitor to the green-bracted Heliconia baha'i. Well, given that the sexes are differing in their use of these heliconias, the next question we asked is, do we see these differences in use of the heliconias reflected in the floral traits? That is, do the floral traits correspond to the morphology of the birds? And the answer is yes, they do. If you look at flowers of Heliconia caribea on the right, you can see that they're short and straight, corresponding to the male bill. And flowers of Heliconia baha'i on the left are long and curved, corresponding to the female bill. And I should note that these flowers are actually presented upside down to the birds. Moreover, what we found is that inflorescences of Heliconia caribea visited by males, shown in the lower right, have significantly more bracts and flowers per inflorescence than inflorescences of Heliconia baha'i, shown in the lower left. Again, this is what you'd expect because males are so much larger than females and require so much more food or energy to drive them. Now, these results provide fairly conclusive evidence that the sexual dimorphism in bills of these purple-throated Caribs is driven by their food sources. But the clincher came when we visited 2 of the 4 reserves on St. Lucia. And at these reserves, the red-bracted Heliconia caribea was rare or absent. And in its place, we found this heliconia. And what this heliconia is a red-green morph of Heliconia baha'i. And at these reserves, male purple-throated Caribs were defending territories of the red-green morph against members of their own and other hummingbird species, and females were going to the green morph. Once again, we can ask, do we see these differences in the use of these heliconias reflected in the plant traits? And the answer is yes, we do. Flowers of the red-green morph were significantly shorter and straighter than flowers of the green morph, and moreover, the red-green morph had significantly more bracts per inflorescence than the green morph. Again, this is exactly what you'd expect, given that the larger short-billed males are visiting the red-green morph, and the smaller long-billed females are visiting the green morph. Now, these studies provided the first unambiguous evidence of a sexual dimorphism driven by feeding ecology and competition for food. And I published them in the journal Science, which is the essentially flagship journal in science in the United States. I'm very fond of saying that the purple-throated Carib was the bird that got me tenure, literally, and I absolutely adore this creature. Now, at this point, this was the first study I had done in this system. And one of the things I can say as an ecologist is that island systems have been crucial for testing ideas in ecology because islands provide natural experiments where you can go from one island to the next to see how systems vary and see if you can gain insights on evolution. Moreover, if you're in the Caribbean, why would you want to leave it? Stay with a good thing. So I decided to stay down there and continue the studies in the Caribbean. And the next island I went to was Dominica. Dominica is another island in the Lesser Antilles, and like St. Lucia, it's an independent state. It's located between the French islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. It's not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, which is in the Greater Antilles. And I went to Dominica because Dominica is referred to as the nature island of the Caribbean. And the reason why it's the nature island is that it's a much more mountainous and rugged island than a lot of the other islands in the Lesser Antilles. This is a photograph I took from the north end of the island looking south. And if you look at Dominica, it's just crossed several times across its length from north to south by numerous mountain ranges. And because it's so mountainous, it really impeded the large banana plantations that you see on a lot of the other islands like St. Lucia or sugar plantations on St. Kitts. In addition, because Dominica is so mountainous, it has lovely elfin cloud forest. This is a photograph I took at Mont Trompiton National Park on Dominica. It's a United Nations Heritage Site. And this is what it looks like on a sunny day. It's a little deceptive because most of the time you are sitting up there in a cloud. It really is cloud forest. And the reason why it's elfin is that the weather conditions are so severe that it results in stunted forest. This particular site has the greatest botanical diversity in the Lesser Antilles. And I have to say that of all the places I've visited in the Caribbean, it's my favorite site. It's really just exquisite if you visit there in April and everything's in flower. Well, once again, I decided that the first thing to do on Dominica would be to determine what are the food plants for the purple-throated Carib. And it turns out they were exactly the same as the food plants on St. Lucia, with differences. Once again, we found Heliconia baha'i. But in contrast to St. Lucia, where you had two morphs of Heliconia baha'i, a green morph and a red-green morph, on Dominica, you just have one, a red morph with a yellow stripe. And once again, we also found Heliconia caribea and a red bracted morph of Heliconia caribea. But in addition, we found a second morph, a yellow bracted morph of Heliconia caribea. Well, again, we can ask, do the sexes differ in the use of these heliconias? And we just watch them, and the answer is yes. Again, males were associated exclusively with Heliconia caribea, which they defended as territories against their own and other hummingbird species. Females intruded on male territories to steal food and fed at undefended patches of Heliconia caribea, and they were the sole visitor to Heliconia baha'i. Again, we can ask, are these differences in the use of these heliconias reflected in the traits of the plants? And the answer is yes. Flowers of Heliconia caribea are short and straight, corresponding to male bills. Flowers of Heliconia baha'i are long and curved, corresponding to female bills. But the fascinating thing about Dominica is that at several of the sites we visited in the lowland rainforest, male and female purple-throated Caribs were partitioning the red and yellow morphs of Heliconia caribea, with males defending territories of the yellow morph, females defending territories of the red morph. And when we looked at traits of these two Heliconia caribea morphs, we found that flowers of the red-bracted Heliconia caribea morph were significantly longer and more curved, and inflorescences had significantly fewer bracts and flowers per inflorescence than flowers of the yellow morph. This is exactly what you'd expect, given that the long curved-billed females that are smaller are visiting the red morph, and the short-billed, larger males are visiting the yellow morph. The complete reversal between the two Heliconia species, between St. Lucia and Dominica, in terms of which has two color morphs, combined with the complete reversal in the change in direction of flower length and curvature and number of bracts per inflorescence, provided, in the words of Rob Caldwell, who was one of the members of the editorial board of science who reviewed this paper, incontrovertible proof of coevolution between the purple-throated Carib and its Heliconia food plants. I'm always grateful for somebody else making this argument for me. Now, at this point, we had really established the purple-throated Carib as a model organism for sex difference that's driven by feeding ecology. But one of the things we try to do in ecology is see if we have general patterns. And so the concern about this is this purple-throated Carib simply an isolated case and just a unique phenomenon on islands, or is this pattern of sex differences more broadly distributed? And to study this, I continued looking at the Caribbean. And one of the islands I went to was the island of Trinidad. Trinidad is an island south of the Lesser Antilles. It's located 7 miles off the coast of Venezuela. And it's extremely tropical in the sense that you've got really incredible bird diversity on the island. Wonderful place to go birding. And if you went there to go birding, and now's a nice time of year to think about it, the place I recommend is the Asa Wright Nature Center in the Arima Valley at the north end of the island. There are lovely cabins to stay in, and then there's a plantation house, and you get up in the morning at 6 o'clock to have coffee, and you watch the hummingbirds coming into the feeders along with parrots and oropendulas and raptors out in the rainforest. And then in the evening, you gather for cocktails at 6 and watch the bats coming in, and it's just amazing. Now, if you go to Trinidad, it turns out that Heliconia caribea doesn't occur there. But Heliconia baha'i is there, and this is what Heliconia baha'i looks like on Trinidad. And then also, the purple-throated Carib doesn't occur on Trinidad. The southernmost part of purple-throated Carib's geographic range goes down to St. Vincent, but it's absent from Grenada and Tobago and Trinidad. And one of the hummingbirds that does occur on Trinidad is this one, the rufous-breasted hermit, Glaucus hirsuta. If you look at hermit hummingbirds, they are the smaller of two subfamilies of hummingbirds, the Phaethornithinae, a group of hummingbirds that have about 35 to 40 species, depending upon the taxonomy. They are called hermits because they lack a lot of the bright, showy colors of the Trochilinae, the larger group of hummingbirds. Species like the ruby throat and rufous hummingbird purple throat, where you have males with these brilliant gorgets. If you look at the hermits, you can see they're drab colored. The other characteristic of hermit hummingbirds is that many of them have very long, often curved bills. I started looking at these hermit hummingbirds in museum collections, and what I discovered is that many of the species have sexual dimorphism and bill curvature, much like the purple-throated Carib. You're looking at a pair of rufous-breasted hermits. The male is above, the female is below. The male has the straight, long bill. The female has a long curved bill. I collaborated with Jill Miller, my colleague at Amherst College, and one of our honor students, Joanne Rivkin, who is now a researcher at the University of Michigan, to look at the distribution of sexual dimorphism in bills in hermit hummingbirds. And we found that most of the species exhibit sex differences in bill curvature, with males having straighter bills than females. And in many of the species, the sex differences are extremely pronounced, such as the Phaethornis longirostris, Phaethornis guy, and the Glaucus species. And this sort of sexual dimorphism that's as extreme as the purple throat occurs in about half of the 35 to 40 species of hermits. Researchers haven't studied how this relates to the food sources of the birds to the extent that I've studied the purple-throated Carib, but there have been a couple of studies. One of them was conducted by a British graduate student named Joe Taylor, who worked on the green hermit hummingbird, Phaethornis guy, in Costa Rica for his master's degree. And he reported that male green hermits visited Heliconia beckneri, female green hermits visited Heliconia tortuosa. Joe didn't know that these green hermits differed in bill curvature. And I actually got a hold of pictures of the flowers that they visit. And lo and behold, the male green hermit is visiting a straight flowered heliconia. The female is visiting curved flowered heliconia. When I was on Trinidad, I conducted watches of Heliconia baha'i with curved flowers and then another Heliconia hirsuta, with straight flowers. And I found that the straight-billed male rufous hermits and green hermits were visiting the straight-flowered Heliconia hirsuta, whereas the curved-billed female rufous-breasted hermits and green hermits were visiting the curved-flowered Heliconia baha'i. So the take-home message here is that hummingbirds in general are probably a model organism for feeding ecology, driving the evolution of sex differences. And I would say almost that if you are looking at hummingbirds, you have to look at a lot of the species and realize that the males and females are doing very different things in many cases and often acting as different species. And I'll be happy to answer more questions about that because there's certainly a lot more I can say on it. What I want to do with the remaining time I have this evening is talk about what's happened to these systems now. And in particular, as an ecologist advising students about field studies, one of the things I have to tell them is that it's becoming very hard to go out in the field now and not deal with climate change. If you're working around Amherst or Springfield, we've had lots of droughts the last few summers. There are always water rationing in Hadley, and certainly a lot of the local wildflowers I work on here suffered greatly as a result of droughts. If you look at the Caribbean, what's been happening are hurricanes. And on September 19th, 2017, the island of Dominica received a direct hit from Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Maria was a Category 5 hurricane when it passed over Dominica. It had 185 mile per hour winds. It was the greatest natural disaster to strike Dominica in modern recorded history. To give you an idea of just how immense this hurricane was, this is Puerto Rico up here and Hispaniola right next to it. You're looking at the entire Lesser Antilles. That's a hurricane that's about 500 miles in diameter. It's enormous. This is what the island looks like after a Category 5 hurricane. The photo on the left was posted on an online news site on Dominica a couple weeks after the hurricane. You're seeing rainforest on the east side of the island. Basically, what happened is that these hurricanes, Category 4 and 5, act as giant vacuum cleaners. They just snap all the branches off of the trees and suck everything out to sea, and all you're left with are tree trunks stuck in the ground, much like toothpicks. I got to Dominica in April 2018 and took the photographs on the right. You are looking at a photograph of rainforest in Mount Diablotin on the west side of the island, more sheltered, and a photograph at Emerald Pool on the east side of the island. Again, the white you're seeing are the trunks of rainforest trees. The green vegetation looks like the plants are leafing out, but that's really not the case. What's happening is vines are growing up from the forest floor and covering everything. They would normally be shaded out by the forest canopy, but without that, they grow. I actually asked the Dominicans about removing the vines to keep them from choking vegetation, and they said they were terrified to do so for fear that you would then have rains causing landslides. And just to show you, in the top photo on the right, you see that clear area there where my pointer is. That was a major landslide that took out one of my study sites permanently and just carried it right off the mountain. Now, when I got to Dominica in April of 2018, I surveyed purple-throated Caribs on territories. I captured them in mist nets, and I looked at birds at feeders at hotels and estimated that they suffered at least a 75% decline in population numbers, with only about 25% of the birds remaining. That was true for the other hummingbird species as well as frugivorous birds like parrots. I want to emphasize that the reason for the mortality was not that the hurricane killed them directly, but rather that the hurricane basically blew away all the flowers and fruits, so there was nothing for these birds to eat, and most of them starved to death. My visit to Dominica was supposed to coincide with the peak flowering of the native heliconia, but what I found is that the native heliconias were not in flower and lagging behind in growth. And the only heliconia that was in flower was this one, which is Heliconia wagneriana. Heliconia wagneriana is native to Central America, and it was introduced to Dominica as an ornamental in flower gardens. It had since escaped flower gardens and had become naturalized in many lowland areas on Dominica. If you look at Heliconia wagneriana, it has much longer flowers than the native heliconias. Its flowers measure 50 to 59 millimeters in length. To put that in perspective, flowers of Heliconia baha'i visited by female purple-throated Caribs measure 45 to 50 millimeters in length. Flowers of Heliconia caribea visited by male purple-throated Caribs measure 34 to 40 millimeters in length. Remember, too, that the native heliconias produce 100 to 250 microliters of nectar per flower. Flowers of Heliconia wagneriana only produce up to 90 microliters of nectar per flower. Well, quite serendipitously, I had actually studied this plant a few months before Hurricane Maria with Gabriella Bishop, one of my honors students, and if you look at the graph on the right, we simply sat at patches of Heliconia wagneriana to see what hummingbirds visited it, and we found that all visits to Heliconia wagneriana prior to Hurricane Maria were by female purple-throated Caribs. And moreover, we found that these females visited Heliconia wagneriana plants randomly with respect to flower length, or something I call corolla length. It's just the length of flowers. They basically went to plants regardless of the length of the flowers. I'd expect females to be the visitor to Heliconia wagneriana because they are the hummingbird with the longest bill on Dominica. One of my research interests has been to measure natural selection on plant traits and animal traits. And basically the way you do this is you simply look at a trait on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and examine it in relation to some sort of fitness measure. In the case of plants, seeds per plant. And when we looked at selection on flower length or corolla length, we found absolutely no significant selection on corolla length. Again, that's what you'd expect because females are visiting plants randomly and all the plants are getting pollinated. After Hurricane Maria, the situation was quite different. If you look at the graph on the right and look at visits following Hurricane Maria, prior to the hurricane, females were the primary visitor. After the hurricane, the primary visitor to Heliconia wagneriana were short-billed male purple-throated Caribs, and they accounted for 55% of the visits to Heliconia wagneriana. Moreover, these males visited plants non-randomly, and they preferentially visited the plants with the shortest flowers. I was able to go up to plants after males visited them and collect flowers, and what I found was that the amount of nectar remaining in a flower was directly related to the length of the flower. The longer the flower, the more nectar left behind, or to put it another way, males could only extract nectar from the shortest flowers and preferred the shortest flowered plants. Well, given that these males are preferentially visiting the short-flowered plants, it's the short-flowered plants that are getting pollinated. And this resulted in very strong selection for shorter flowers in these populations. Now, these graphs are showing you data on the plants. What about the birds? Remember that 75% of the purple-throated Caribs died as a result of the hurricane. And I had actually collected data on purple-throated Carib measurements prior to Hurricane Maria. I had measured about 100 birds prior to the hurricane. And what I'm presenting to you are histograms of the bird measurements. On the left, you're looking in the left column is bill length, in the middle is wing length, and then on the right is tarsus length. The upper row are males, the bottom rows are females. The white are measurements prior to the hurricane, and the black are measurements after. And if you look first at the middle panels and right panels for wing length and tarsus length, these are measures of overall size. And what you can see is that surviving purple-throated Caribs, males and females, were significantly smaller after Hurricane Maria than before it. I interpret this as a consequence of the loss of the food supply. Larger individuals require more food to sustain themselves than smaller individuals, and the surviving purple-throated Caribs, both male and female, were the smallest purple throats in the population. If you look at the graph on the left, you're looking at bill length. And what you can see is that surviving male purple-throated Caribs had significantly longer bills after the hurricane than before. This wasn't the case for females. I interpret this as a direct consequence of the long flowers of Heliconia wagneriana. Male purple-throated Caribs have short bills, and only the males with the longest bills could extract nectar from these flowers. Female bills were long enough to do so. Consistent with this hypothesis is that birds at feeders at the hotels that I worked at had significantly shorter bills and larger size than birds in the forest. The hotels were putting out feeders right after the hurricane and keeping them alive. Now, I did this study in 2018, and then COVID came along and shut down fieldwork. And by the time I was able to start up again in 2022, I was in my late 60s and thinking, Ethan, how many more years are you going to do this? You're starting to get a little old to be hiking around the mountains. And I was literally standing in the airport at Dominica, which, to put it in perspective, is about the size of a large bedroom. And a young man came up behind me and said, "Are you Ethan Temeles?" And I said, "Yes." And he introduced himself, and his name was Bo Dausgaard, and he was a professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And he was on the island to start looking at hummingbirds and their food plants with his graduate students and postdocs. And I thought, how wonderful. I really would like to hand this system off to a younger generation to continue studies. And so we've been working together now for the last few years and writing papers together and have continued these studies. And if you look at what's happened more recently, in 2022 and 2023, the purple throat population is still about 25% of pre-hurricane sizes, as are the populations of the other hummingbirds on Dominica. And just to show them to you, these birds are lovely. The Antillean crested hummingbird, the beautiful blue-headed hummingbird, the lovely green-throated Carib. And then there are birds like bananaquits and lesser Antillean bullfinches. And prior to the hurricane, the bananaquit was a nectar thief. It would basically pierce flowers and rob them. The bullfinch would pick flowers and drink nectar. Well, what's happened is that because the purple throats, so many of them have died, you no longer have males defending Heliconia caribea plants. And likewise, you don't have a lot of females going to Heliconia baha'i, and normally they would just drain beehive flowers of nectar. But because so few purple throats are there, all these hummingbirds are now visiting the heliconias, and all of them are acting as pollinators of these plants. Now, the question is, what does the future hold? As I said to Bo, I'm not going to be around 25 years from now. Your students are going to have to get back and see what is happening to the system. This was a system that was driven by very tight coevolution between male and female purple-throated Caribs, and the competition that they were excluding other hummingbirds and maintaining these close relationships, it's all broken down. And so the question for the future is, what will happen to this system? In summary, the purple throat is a model case of a feeding ecology driving a sex difference, as well as competition driving the evolution of these plants. And it's just been a really great pleasure to study this for so many years. I'm going to quit and thank the governments of St. Lucia and Dominica and Trinidad for allowing me to work there, a variety of students and collaborators, and support from the National Science Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, and Amherst College. And I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And the photographs, were those your photographs?
Yes, most of them.
Great. Vince, are you there? Do you want to lead the questions?
Yes, I'm here. Let's go to the questions on in the chat. And our first question uh, is from Tyler, and he asks, are there any examples of sexual dimorphism from food selection seen in any North American birds?
Yes, I would say it's my own feeling about the hummingbirds in North America is that you don't see the bill curvature. And so if you're looking at ruby-throated or rufous hummingbirds, females are larger than males. They have a longer bill than males. And so it becomes more ambiguous as to whether the sexual dimorphism is really a function of feeding ecology. But female ruby-throated hummingbirds and male ruby-throated hummingbirds, female rufous hummingbirds and male rufous hummingbirds don't have any overlap in bill length, all right? They really differ in bill length. And I suspect that there are plants that each sex uses that can be different. Certainly it's the case that in North America, a lot of the migratory hummingbirds, the males depart before females and are likely even migrating on somewhat different routes than female hummingbirds. And so they're hitting different food sources. And I would love to be able to live for another 100 years to study this. You're asking a really good question. I should also note, I did my master's degree and PhD dissertation on birds of prey, where there are lots of very sexually dimorphic species. And the bird I worked on was the northern harrier for my PhD dissertation. And they too exhibit sexual differences in diet and things of that sort. So yes, there are other species. They just haven't been studied as intensively. And then fans of woodpeckers, males and female woodpeckers are partition a lot of habitats. They don't necessarily differ in diet, but they do partition different parts of the tree. So I would say that, yes, there are probably a lot more widespread. It's just harder to study and less clear than in something like the purple-throated Carib or these hermit hummingbirds, where you can directly tie the bill curvature to the flowers and there's no ambiguity in what's going on. And that's what made this possible. I just really lucked out in finding the right system to study.
All right, thank you. Next question. What is the biological advantage of sexual dimorphism in feeding ecology rather than both sexes adapting to as many types of heliconia as available? And that's from Andrea.
That's an excellent question. If you look at animals, you will often have sex differences. And I suspect that some of it may have to do, in the case of birds of prey, it's been talked about as maybe allowing male and female to differ in diet, which can be advantageous for feeding young on the nest, so that they're collecting different foods and not competing with each other for limited food supplies. In the case of hummingbirds, I think it's basically because the males and females are living pretty much a different life, except for when they come together to mate. All right. Male hummingbirds are not involved in any sort of parental care. And I think that you're just seeing something where the two sexes are just separated and really under selection to differ. All right. They're just living a different kind of ecology. And it's like I said, I look at a lot of them and just think you have to think of them as being almost separate species because they're doing different things.
Okay, thank you. And Miles and Kathy would like to know, I think I'm understanding that flower structure of heliconia drives the differences between males and females in the Carib hummers and a few hermits. Why aren't all or other species of hummers also affected in the same way?
Some of them are. So if you were to look at the fascinating sickle-billed hummingbirds in Central and South America, the ones with the Eutoxaries genus with the bills that are curved 90 degrees, or then the sword-billed hummingbirds, they most certainly have co-evolved with some of their food plants. Uh, it's This is a very big question in pollination biology, is the degree to which some systems become specialized and some become generalized. And I think it's just a question of the degree to which some species can monopolize these food plants. One of the things I'm excited about with this group I'm working with in Copenhagen is that they hope to be able to do the genomics of these birds. It's now gotten very inexpensive to do the genomes of species. Um, and if that can be done, what they'd like to do is see if we can track the evolution of this system from island to island to start piecing together how these birds and heliconias evolved with each other. I'm hoping I'm still alive to see the results they get when they do this, if they can do it, because it would really answer some questions about how this system evolved.
Okay, Tyler has another question. He says, after the hurricane, is there still only one species of heliconia on the island of Dominica? Did any of the pre-hurricane heliconia survive? Maybe they were protected by resorts and thus got pollinated.
Yeah, yeah. No, the two native heliconias survived just fine after the hurricane. They weren't flowering, but they actually did beautifully after the hurricane because without the rainforest canopy, they were now getting more nutrients and just took off. And you had these gargantuan plants covering everywhere after the hurricane. It's the birds that have suffered. The only reason why the birds haven't bounced back is that during the fall and wintertime, a lot of their food sources also the rainforest canopy flowers, the trees flower, and without the rainforest canopy, they don't have the food, and the rainforest canopy hasn't come back. I should note that the plants that did flower after the hurricane, Heliconia wagneriana, that's a non-native plant. It's introduced, and there are studies which show that introduced plants basically do well following disturbances. Plants that become invasive species become invasive because they're able to deal with human disturbance of habitat. And I'm not surprised in looking around Dominica that the plants that flowered after the hurricane were the ones that could handle disturbance. It's the native plants that were fragile.
All right. Peggy comments, I just saw the white-tipped sicklebill at Canopy Lodge in central Panama hanging
It's so
out for
lucky.
a few days at a bright red heliconia next to the lodge. We never saw two, so I don't know if the bird was male or female, but the bill was deeply curved.
And I want one. All right. Any student who gives me one gets an A. Yeah. You too.
All right. Any other questions out there? Oh, wait, here's one that just popped up. This is from Jim. He says, fascinating presentation. Thank you. Do you have an idea of what may happen to the Caribs given their decrease in numbers and phenotypic genetic diversity in the face of increased competition from the other birds?
You're asking a great question. I published a paper with Bo Dalsgaard 2 years ago in Current Biology on this. What the big issue in the Caribbean, and I wish it received more attention in the American press, is that if we have more frequent Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, then it's conceivable that you may see some extinctions. I participate in a hurricane. It's the HERS group. It's the Hurricane Ecosystem Research Synthesis group that formed after these hurricanes to really get a group of people together thinking about what's going on. And one of the details that were reported is the Bahama nuthatch is presumably extinct as a result of Hurricane Maria and Irma. And then if you look at the Puerto Rican parrot and the Puerto Rican sharp-shinned hawk, the numbers had been up to about 500 and they're now down to less than 100. If you were to look at the imperial parrot on Dominica, which is the world's largest Amazon, it was up around 500, but after the hurricane is below 100. And so the question would be, if there isn't another category 5 for the next 40 or 50 years, these animals will come back. But if we have a hurricane every 5 to 10 years that's a category 4 or 5, then that may not happen and you may start losing species. And so that's the big issue, is just how frequently are these hurricanes going to happen? If they are more frequent, then we're going to start seeing some changes in these systems because they're just going to be constantly disrupted. And at that point, you'll end up with a free-for-all. And I suspect that you will see a relaxation of the tight relationships between these plants and the hummingbirds that I've documented. But again, we'll have to see what happens.
Right. Any other questions out there? Specific questions? No. People are now saying thank you very much, Andrea, and others are saying thank you very much for your presentation. And I also want to say thank you. I thought it was a most interesting presentation. Great job, and yes, thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. And this is absolutely the most awesome hummingbird you can ever see. So I hope all of you have the opportunity to see it because they're just gorgeous and really fun. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.